Welcome to Dowdell Library's virtual exhibit. My name is Miss Mary Ann, and I will be hosting today's virtual exhibit, and we have a special exhibit for you, which Suzanne Ryan will be talking about the Victorian era and the types of mourning jewelry, clothing, customs, and superstitions during that period. So now I'm going to hand it over to Suzanne.
Thank you, Mary Ann. I appreciate your help, and I'm so grateful to be here. This is kind of an unusual topic to talk about, but it's a part of all of our lives. The mourning period has been a part of our lives going back as far as the Egyptian time. We have celebrated the mourning. We have taken very good care of the deceased in wrapping the bodies and trying to keep them as best we can. And that has gone from the Egyptian period up until the mourning period, and even today. But in particular, the mourning period, a great deal of money and time was spent on the mourning period of the Victorian era. Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901, was well known for wearing her jewels. She was always well dressed. She married the love, I don't know if it was the love of her life, but it was a man who she took and loved very, very dearly. He was taken very early. He was only 42 years old, and that was Prince Albert. And it was really sad because she mourned him until her death, and that was some years ago, years later. It was 40 years that she spent in mourning. And her children, 9 of them, also spent a good portion of their time in mourning as well. Society ruled as to what you were to wear during your mourning period. And it was the queen in the palace that really dictated that. She wore, before mourning, Queen Victoria wore a lot of jewelry. She wore a lot of the jewelry of the palace, which many of her predecessors did not. And she was always on top of her fashion. Now it also helped that they knew that, and all the periodicals would really post, fashion magazines would bring the palace to your home. Now, what woman wouldn't want to have the clothing that was used in a palace? So they were dark, but they were very decorative and in good taste. You needed to know what you were going to do during your mourning period. The English always wore black, and so did Americans. Many countries wore white, and that was not because of any particular age group. It was just white was preferred over black. But even today, black is known for mourning.
Now, if I could ask a question.
Sure.
When you say, you know, the color was black for mourning, now does that mean just adults or adults down to children?
Adults and children wore black. However, if it was a child that died, very often they would initiate white into it somewhere along the line. The pallbearers would wear a white band. There were other things that we'll talk about, but children, they had white that they used somewhere in the house and during the funeral procession. I often wondered where they got all this information. If somebody died in the Victorian period, where was it written that they had to do something specific? And actually there is a book called Queen and Castles, which has all the Victorian guidelines, and especially for a woman whose husband may have died. She would get all her guidelines from this one particular book, and if you look it up and Google it, it still exists. I was surprised to see that there was so much information for somebody to follow, and specifically about death and what you needed to do, because even today you need to file paperwork, and you need to go to the city, and you need to do this, and you need to do that. This is all documented in this book as to what paperwork you have to file, how long you have to stay in mourning, all the specifics. So the lady of the house always had a guideline to follow in the mourning period. Many times, people plan their funerals long before they thought of death. And they would tell everybody, they'd have it in writing as to what they wanted as a coffin, how they wanted it being taken care of. Women would make their shroud and put it in a part of their dowry. so that they would have it when they married. They knew how they were to be buried. It was hand engraved or had their name embroidered on it. It was very intricate. But shrouds were used to wrap the bodies. They weren't, in today's time, we dress them in clothing. That was not the case during that period. It was, they were wrapped in a shroud, and then they were buried. They were embalmed at home with arsenic, and it was the doctor that did it at that time. That was before funeral homes were actually in existence. An invitation was sent out. When somebody died, it was normally put in a newspaper if they lived in a big city. However, very often they lived in the country. They had no way of really, couldn't telephone somebody and tell them that somebody had passed. An immediate invitation went out to all their friends and relatives. It was engraved and it was outlined in black, noting that somebody had passed, and sent out immediately in the post so that they were noted that somebody had died in the family.
Similar to like our obituaries today,
Yep,
right?
that's exactly what it would be. It would be an invitation to come and say goodbye to their loved one. And you knew when you got the mail that somebody had died because of the outline of the black. And it was on the inside card as well as the envelope. And this goes back to the 1800s. So that's to have it engraved in 2 days, that in itself was amazing. Pallbearers that were during that period, funeral homes weren't really into the business line yet, but they had 4 to 6 pallbearers that would carry the coffin, and they would have black gloves, they wore a black band. If it was a child, they'd wear white and a white band, and they were usually friends of the family. However, the future funeral home would get these people if you needed them. And in that book I referred to earlier, it would give you the prices of what a carriage with 2 horses and for people to carry the coffin. It would give you all the details that you really needed to know. Now, after the funeral, the pallbearers were very often given a mourning spoon. This is a gold one. Usually they had silver. And if you ever buy a silver set, you usually get more than 8 or 12 pieces. You usually get extras because you're usually the ones that get thrown out. That's the teaspoons that they got. They would hand to the pallbearers with the name of the person who deceased, and the date of their birth and their death. And that was like a momentum, a gift of thanks to the pallbearers.
Wow, that's unique. That's different.
Yeah. And that's very prominent. You see a lot of the mourning spoons that were during that period, late 1800s, beginning 1900s. So that was an unusual gift, but nonetheless, it was a gift. Now, Jay's in London was the place to go for all your mourning goods. It was a bit of a warehouse type of place, and we have their ad, the original ad. And they were really the first retailer that was a warehouse type of environment where you could just go and pick out a mourning piece, a dress, accessories that you needed, or you could have them come to your house and fit it for you directly. But it was already made. You didn't have to wait for a seamstress to put things together. And the reason for that was, if somebody passed and you had a mourning outfit, you could never wear the same mourning outfit again. It had to be burned. And that was one of their superstitions. So mourning clothes were constantly being purchased because death, I think the average age was 50 years old.
Yeah, it was quite young, yes.
And the mortality of children was extremely high. So if you had 2 deaths in a year, you had to buy a full wardrobe twice a year to fit your mourning clothes.
Wow.
So this guy Jay in London made a bundle.
I was just going to say,
He did extremely well. And you see that everywhere. You want to go someplace to get mourning clothes, you go to Jay's, which I find pretty funny.
I didn't realize that afterwards, they burned the clothes and then you had to purchase, a new.
Whole new outfits.
Yeah, a whole new wardrobe just for that. And like you stated, back then, obviously because of medicine wasn't advanced, I mean, there were a lot of deaths at young ages.
Right.
I mean, so what now, you're talking the upper class? Now what about the lower class? Did they, because
lower class would also, society dictated, regardless of what your stage was, and even the lower class people, they would take food away from their children in order to buy a coffin or the clothing or something that they needed for their funeral. So it was really important that you had a good funeral, that you went out in style. It may not have been to the extent that the upper class people did, but they still had maybe just a wooden box that the person was buried in. It wasn't hand engraved. It didn't have a lot of elaborate embellishments on it, but nonetheless, they all had a very socially acceptable funeral.
Wow.
So
yeah, that's interesting.
it was, and they had a lot of money at that time too, so
Well,
a lot of money was spent on funerals. Now, a woman was expected, if her husband passed, a woman had to sit in mourning for 2 years. 2 years. She originally wore black, and it was a very stiff material, and I'm going to come over here and show you. It was fairly simple, and it was really not very pretty, and they lined the bottom of it in a crepe material, which is really, really a scratchy, thick material that they put on the bottom. And it was to remind them that mourning was not a fun thing to go through. The jewelry was always dark, and the capes, which this was a bit of an elaborate cape, but this was a black cape that they would wear. Everything was black. So again, the ladies had to be in mourning. They wore a full veil for the first 3 months, and then afterwards they took the veil off. And here is a little mourning cap. This is from the 1910. It's a little discolored. The velvet has discolored.
But it's gorgeous.
It is. It's a little tilt hat. It could have been a children's hat for all I know. It's very small, and normally they didn't use velvet. Velvet was an expensive material.
Okay.
So I'm thinking that it's either half mourning, which was a year after mourning began, or it was a child's hat. Ladies, again, had to be in mourning for 2 years. The first year they wore black for the first couple of months. Families were able to come and visit, but they had to visit within 7 days of the death. Shortly after that period, she would take her veil off. She was not able to go out socially. She wouldn't go to dances. She wouldn't go to visit. She was committed to staying in her home. After about 6 months, she could change up the color a little bit. It went from gray to a lilac mauve color, and then it went to white. And that was after the first year of mourning, which we'd call half mourning. But that second year, they could go out socially, but they couldn't dance. They could visit, but they couldn't really do anything that was fun. They had to sit and really remember the person that had passed. Now, contrary to that, men...
I was just going to ask that. Did that hold true for men too? No, of course not.
Men had to be in mourning for 3 months.
Oh, big difference.
Yeah. He wore a band on his hat with black. He wore a band sometimes on his arm in black. He wore his normal dark suit. Very often his cravat would be black. Okay. And his buttons on his cuffs would be black. But after 3 months, he was done. Children also went into mourning, but they weren't expected the same amount of time that an adult would have to. It was really the woman of the house was the one that really had to spend the time in mourning. And which is really sad. But
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's such a strict regimen to follow. You know, and you're not talking, like you said, 3 months. You're talking, you know, basically two whole years of your life.
Yeah. Well, Queen Victoria was in mourning, and she wore black clothes for 40 years.
Yeah.
Until her death in 1901. And that I find amazing.
Well, she married her true love.
She did.
That's
she
why.
did. And she had a neck piece with his picture on it that
Yes.
she wore every single day. So I'm going to go back over here. I don't mean to. This, on the other hand, was a woman's dress. And this is probably after her first year of mourning.
Okay.
Because it's a little more elaborate. She was probably going out, not to a dance, but socially maybe to visit. Because there is lace.
Yeah, the detail in that.
This was a rich lady.
Yes, yes.
It's unfortunate that it's kind of falling apart up top, but you can see this crepe material at the bottom. And it was used, again, it's cheap, and it was just used to remind them that they are still in mourning. This is not comfortable, and they want you to know that. Some of the superstitions that went hand in hand. When somebody passed, immediately all the windows were closed, the mirrors were covered, which in some today we're still, some families still do that. I think the Jewish religion, we still cover the mirrors. They said Shiva, which is on a chair, and that's very similar to some of these things. But the Victorians would cover the mirrors because they didn't want the spirit of the person to look back at anybody. They would immediately put the pictures down of any other family members that they had in the living room or in the sitting room, and that is so that spirit could not see any of those other people and take them with them.
Wow.
Clocks were stopped, and they were not started until after the burial. The same with the windows. The windows were not opened until after the burial.
And how long before the burial? Like
it was, well, depended on people coming in.
Okay.
But usually it was 3 to 7 days. Very often, if they were buried within a day or so, it was usually somebody that didn't have the money to go through a big burial. Another superstition is they would always carry the dead person out feet first, and it was so they couldn't look back to see if anybody else, they could grab anybody else and take with them.
Oh my goodness.
They were very superstitious people. The last thing that I remember, or two things, if thunder played during the time that they were being buried, that was the dead saying, "I'm here, I'm fine, go home and live your life."
Oh gosh, I got goosebumps. Yes.
And the oddest thing that I read was very often in the coffin, a person was given a rope, and the rope went outside of the coffin, and it was attached to a bell. In case that person came back to life, they'd ring that bell so somebody knew that they were still alive and they had to come and get them out of the coffin.
Oh, wow.
Now it kind of makes sense when you think about medical world. You know, somebody had a massive coronary or some kind of emergency, they may be out for a day or so and not know that, people don't know that they're not dead, and they had no way of knowing that.
Or even if they went into a coma.
Right.
Exactly. And your breathing is very shallow in that. I mean, because there are stories that I've read that has happened.
Oh, yeah.
That they were buried alive. They thought that they had passed.
They had scratching on the inside.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. So that's when this whole bell thing came into play. Some of the jewelry was still prevalent during that period, but it was not ostentatious. You know, the Victorians loved their jewels. They wanted to dress up. They were just loved the social life and what it held, and the jewelry played a big part. But now, with mourning, they could not really wear anything but black. So they wore what we call jet, and it's a black, people say, oh, it's onyx. No, it's not. Jet is really kind of just material from old trunks of trees and things that had been compressed and made into beads. And they made them into necklaces. And I have pins here that are mourning periods. And they all have specific meanings to them, because some of them may have the hands crossed. They may have forget-me-nots. Forget-me-nots were flowers that were very often used in jewelry because it was a symbol of, we don't want to forget you. Some of the pieces were done in ivory. A lot of it was done in materials that were taken from trunks of trees and things and had been melted into different shapes and sizes, and you'll be able to see a lot of these here.
Now with this jewelry, the mourning jewelry here, with the onyx and the black and that, was that the same, like the jeweler had all these pieces made up already for them? And
go to Jay's.
Yeah, I was just, and now, did they have to also burn that with their clothing and buy new items for somebody else passed away?
No, the jewelry wasn't a part of it. It was just the
clothing.
Just the clothing. Yeah, the jewelry that was never mentioned that I had ever seen.
Okay.
It was definitely the clothing. The clothing once and it was done. You didn't get to use it anymore. The other fascination that really came about during that period was they had, very often they would put the picture of the dead person in a pin and they would wear it. And again, children were unfortunately some of the ones that were the most casualty of the casualty. And so you see a lot of small children on these picture pins. Photographs were very expensive. However, if somebody passed, the family very often would gather and they would put the dead person up on the bed, they'd open their eyes, and they'd all gather around and take a picture with the person that had deceased.
Oh, wow.
And you find a lot of pictures that are with the deceased in it. And children who are laying in their bassinet or their little beds, they don't usually take pictures with them. They're single pictures. But photographs of the dead was a very common feature in that time. Hair was another fascination, and they did elaborate things with hair. And the funny thing about hair is our bodies will decompose and fall apart, but the hair still exists. You look back as far as the Egyptian time, and some of those bodies that they've unwrapped, the hair is still intact.
Mm-hmm.
I have pieces here that go back into the 1800s. They braided them, they made them into necklaces. I have a beautiful necklace that's got it's a pendant that has a little, I'm not sure, it's an agate, I think, but it's a locket.
It's gorgeous.
It's really, really pretty, and there's a little pearl in it. And then there's another piece here that was probably somebody had died at sea, and it has reference to a sailor. But they made all these pieces, and they carried them around for years and years and years.
It's very intricate, though.
Yeah, yep.
I would not know that that was made out of hair.
And women were taught how to sew and do intricate needlework, and hair was one of them. So the ladies all knew how to do this. This was nothing new. However, Jay's, and they probably have somebody there that would do it, you could order these things. You could have the hair brought to the jeweler, and they would make these pieces. The other thing they would do is they would make these elaborate pieces that hung on the wall. And they would have flower arrangements, they'd have wreaths, and they were just beautiful, extremely costly now, but they would hang on the walls for a long, long period of time. So that was, hair was the thing. I have a small little bracelet here that goes back into the 1800s. Again, it's got gold, it has the initials. Very often you'll find that the initials of the person that had deceased are on the pieces. And the other thing that they did, they made these little memento books, and this is usually children that would do this, but they'd say goodbye to the one that they really cared for, and they would put a little piece inside of it.
That's adorable.
As a thank you. And this is also late 1800s.
Wow.
So,
But this is like similar to what we mothers do today with
with a
our
locket of hair, absolutely.
with our children.
Hair is
Yeah.
always one of those memorial pieces that you have, you know, of your child or even a pet.
Yes,
Very often
yes,
people keep pet
yes.
pieces. But that's pretty much it on the mourning period. Do you have any questions?
I might have a few. I did, you know, I read a little bit about that because I was so intrigued with this and not knowing about the, you know, type of jewelry that they did make. Now, I know that they still have a group of people that actually still do it's called the Hair Workers Society.
Yes.
It was formed in 1994. And they have done many shows and everything in that because they didn't want to lose that tradition and to show the people today what actually went on with this, and to understand why they did this.
Yeah, that's still a. There's also societies that replicate. This one piece I have is a replication. I could not find one of these. And she called me and said, "Oh, we want you to carry all of our pieces," because they want to continue the same. They want to really go through and keep this tradition moving.
Very, very interesting. I know our patrons are going to love this, to see this, and we're also, for our patrons, besides having this virtual exhibit, we are going to have this on show for March and April at the library. So to come down to the library, and you can actually view the items here too. Was there anything else you wanted to add?
I mean,
thank you so much for bringing in this collection. This is just phenomenal.
It's great to be able to talk about it. You know, you kind of hide it behind. You don't bring out anything that has to do with
well, that's just it. It's the history behind everything,
right?
And to learn that some of the similarities of what they had back then are similar to what we have today.
Yep.
You know, like what you said was the actual obituary card, posting it and sending it out, you know, similar to what we put in the newspaper today, or cutting the lock of a child's hair and keeping it like we do, not in death, but for us to keep for our children.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much, Suzanne.
You're welcome.
I hope everybody enjoyed this. I know I did. I was so excited about having you come in to do this. And you can check out the webpage at dow.org on Facebook or Instagram for any daily updates on future virtual exhibits. But don't forget to come down to the library and actually view it for yourself.
Great.
Thank you again.
Thank you. It's good being with you. Take care.